In the past few years, but especially after October 7th, Zionist pundits have hammered down on what they consider to be a key fact of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict: indigeneity. The notion that Jews and/or Israelis are indigenous to the land is frequently deployed to justify Israel's settler colonial project of racial domination over Palestinians, who are correlatively described as foreign to the land, or worse, colonizers. Arabs, after all, say the Zionists, belong in Arabia, and Jews in Judea. In this video, I want to explore this claim from the perspective of international law and post-colonial theory. In particular, I want to explain what appears to be a fundamental Zionist misunderstanding of indigeneity, and thus argue that no, Jews, and in particular Israeli Jews, are not an indigenous people under international law. I think it is important to start this video with a disclaimer about what it is not. This video is not about Jewish identity or about whether Jewish people in general should or should not self-describe as indigenous to Israel. Specifically, while some of my arguments will inevitably apply more broadly to all Jews, this video is about Israeli Jews and the claims some of them make to indigeneity under international law, particularly vis-a-vis their relationship with Palestinians. Indigeneity with a capital I is a complex social, political, and legal term. It is this concept that I will explore in this video. It is a different concept, I would say, from a lowercase I indigeneity. Thus, for example, I am Peruvian, meaning that on a lowercase I concept of indigeneity, I could say that I am indigenous to Peru, meaning that I was born and raised there, and so I belong there. But it would be fundamentally wrong, and in fact quite insensitive of me, if not racist, to argue that I am a capital I indigenous person in Peru. I am not. This linguistic difference is aggravated by the limitations of language. In my native Spanish, for instance, I would not translate lowercase I indigenous to its cognate indígena, but to oriundo. Yo soy oriundo del Perú. I am originally from Peru. Same goes for Jews. They can claim to be originally from Israel without effectively claiming a status as a capital I indigenous people under international law. My objective, therefore, is not to deny the historical, cultural, and religious connection Jewish people have to the land, but simply to argue that these ties do not grant them status under international law as an indigenous people. From the outset, it is important to distinguish the historical and political concept of the indigenous from its legal definition as part of the corpus of international law. While these frequently overlap, it is important to keep in mind their different origin. The political concept of indigenous traces its roots to the otherization and racialization produced as a consequence of the colonial encounter. It is a concept tied to the racialized stereotypes that Europeans ascribe to the Indian and the native. These were meant to be pejorative descriptions referring to primitive people who had not yet civilized. For centuries, the main dynamic through which international law dealt with these Indians and natives was cultural erasure. Indigenous people had to be civilized, acculturated, assimilated, lest they continue to be an obstacle to development. It was not until the 1960s and 1970s that indigenous peoples themselves started reappropriating the identity of indigeneity as a descriptor of global solidarity. Thus, George Manuel, a Shuswap indigenous person from Shakwepmik in modern-day Canada, traveled the world seeking to establish a network of these indigenous people in order to join their struggles into a global movement. As a result of these travels, in 1974, he wrote what would become the Manifesto of Post-Colonial Indigeneity, The Fourth World and Indian Reality. In it, he wrote about how indigeneity was shaped by colonialism. Quote, "Whenever a tribal people have come under the domination of a European power," he wrote, "there has been the common experience of colonialism." End quote. It is this shared tragedy, he argued, that could give birth to indigeneity as an identity of global solidarity rather than discrimination. Quote, "Were this a political experience that did not reach to the very root of our being, striking at the very heart of our view of the world, it would not have forged such a compelling bond between such distant peoples," he said. Thus, what Manuel was attempting in the 1970s was the reappropriation of the term indigenous to transform its meaning from a colonizer term to pejoratively define the colonized into a term by the colonized through which to express their shared struggle with colonialism. Manuel eventually went on to organize this global indigene into the First World Council of Indigenous People. In case it was not clear, no Jewish organization, let alone an Israeli one, was part of these struggles and organizations. By 1974, rather than struggling with colonialism, Israel was very much invested in a colonial project of its own through the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. George Manuel's efforts at reappropriating the concept of indigeneity for his Fourth World inevitably led to institutionalization and regulation attempts. In 1982, the UN created the Working Group on Indigenous Populations to promote and protect the rights of indigenous people. With institutionalization, though, came conceptual problems, the main one being about definitions. If states were meant to safeguard indigenous peoples with special rights, then they needed to know who was and who wasn't an indigenous person. In 1975, the World Council had produced a solemn declaration that essentially defined indigeneity in juxtaposition to the West. The, quote, other people thirsty for blood, gold, and land, as the declaration described them. But the Council was not fond of any kind of objective definition, as clearly the concept was a complex one. This is the reason why there is no officially agreed upon definition of indigenous people under international law. A key concern being that an imperfect definition could lead to ethnic minorities inappropriately claiming indigenous rights. The connection to colonialism was very present in the minds of the group members. Thus, while the more recent UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People does not offer a definition, the 1989 Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization does, referring to those who descend from the, quote, populations which inhabited the country at the time of conquest or colonization, and who retain some or all of their own economic, social, cultural, and political institutions. Similarly, it is from these conceptual debates that we get one particularly influential definition coined by José Martinez Cobo, Special Rapporteur of the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities in 1987. Cognizant of the contestation surrounding the issue, Martinez Cobo was clear this was a provisional definition intended as a point of departure and for criticism and modification. Given its importance, I will read it out despite its length. According to him, quote, indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that develop on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing in those territories or parts of them. The quote continues, they form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems. Martinez Cobo then lists factors that can evidence this historical continuity, including, inter alia, occupation, ancestry, culture, language, and geographical location. This has, in a way, since become a sort of unofficial definition under international law. Okay, so we've established that the concept of indigeneity was born out of the oppression of the colonizer, that it was then appropriated by the colonized and ultimately institutionalized and regulated by international law through the working definition of Martinez Cobo. So far, so good. So, how do Zionist commentators work around this definition so heavily influenced by the colonial encounter to argue that Jews, and particularly Israeli Jews, are indigenous people? Well, they sort of don't. Zionist commentators simply turn this definition on its head and go at it backwards, starting with a cherry-picked version of its list of factors and ignoring that the experience of colonization is indispensable to it. Thus, for instance, Ben Friedman, a Scottish Jewish author who writes about Jewish indigeneity, argues that criteria, quote, rooted in a post-colonial context should be discarded, but offers no reason as to why. This is an absurd argument. The connection to coloniality is so foundational to the reappropriated concept of indigeneity enshrined in international law that one of its most common critiques is that it is, as Georgina Stewart calls it, a, quote, placeholder with no positive categorical content other than its binary opposition to the West. Indigeneity would be, then, some say, an example of strategic essentialism, a stratagem involving essentialism used by indigenous people to support their political objectives. I've talked in a previous video, for instance, of Aymara scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's critique of the NGOization of this legal definition and how it has trapped indigenous people in a theatrical and exoticized identity as rural, primitive, first peoples who guard the forests as opposed to individuals with their own engagement with modernity. George Manuel's reappropriation failing at its mission, so to speak. But as fellow Peruvian scholar Jorge Sanchez Perez argues, even if this statement is correct, even if indigeneity is sometimes deployed as a malleable stratagem, there is still something to gain by closely looking at this indigenous-Western relationship. I would qualify this characterization as a placeholder, though. First, the idea that there is no content to the term indigenous flies in the face of how indigenous people deploy it themselves as a concept, not really just as a stratagem, but as a descriptor of identity too, at least an identity tied to a colonial relationship with the nation-state they inhabit. Second, the notion that indigeneity only exists in a binary with the West seems conceptually flawed. Indigeneity rather exists in a binary with coloniality, regardless of the geographical origin of the colonizer. Morocco, for instance, is deploying coloniality against the Sahrawi indigenous people of Western Sahara. Modern European colonialism has truly gone global, and it is no longer ethnically or geographically bounded. Coloniality as a world order has endured beyond the end of European colonization as a political process. Talking about indigenous people, therefore, is to recognize the existence of human groups whose views and lives have suffered and could potentially continue to suffer exclusion by those who have colonized their lands and with whom they, to this date, share a geographical space. The very concept of indigeneity, its core idea, is premised in the colonial experience. As Troy Storfgel argues, indigeneity describes a certain set of relationships to colonialism, anti-colonialism, and specific lands and places. In other words, resistance to colonization was always part of the definition and the intent. There simply cannot be such a thing as an indigenous people who never experienced colonialism. Thus, if the colonial encounter had never occurred, then the various peoples of the Americas, Asia, or Africa would have never been identified as indigenous to begin with. Indigeneity is a construct that emerged as a result of and in direct opposition to a colonizer, a settler, a conqueror. Of course, once created, as I noted before, the concept is not tied exclusively to Western colonization. Racialized people can engage in colonial practices. Think of Liberia, for instance, or Japan. But even in these contexts, the colonial dynamics of domination between the settler and the native, the indigenous people, is the same. There is no indigeneity without colonial domination. Now, you might think this is not a very good argument against Jewish indigeneity because Jewish people have been, in fact, colonized in the past, by the Romans, for example, or the Egyptians in biblical times. But this argument fundamentally misunderstands the kind of colonial relation indigeneity describes. Indigeneity's binary relationship does not involve just any situation of domination. It involves modern colonialism specifically. Modern colonialism is just that. It is modern. It is, to be precise, produced by Western modernity, the set of values and norms that emerged from the European Renaissance and Enlightenment. You might think Enlightenment is a good thing, but I do not mean this in praise. You see, yes, many human societies have conquered others and established relations that we could describe as, I would say, pre-modern colonialism. But there is a fundamental difference in the jump to modernity, particularly after the colonial encounter of 1492. Yes, many human societies have conquered others, but these conquests are based on religious or ancestry grounds. My God is better than yours, or I deserve this land more. Not many societies, even conquering societies, actually engaged in a process of racialization, meaning not all of them invented racism. Modern European enlightened societies most certainly did. Hell, they are the paradigmatic example of a racist order. Under Western modern canons, white Europeans are ontologically, by their very selves, better than non-white non-Europeans. Even the best, smartest, handsomest, strongest Inca or enslaved African was still considered ontologically inferior to the dumbest, ugliest, weakest white European. This is a dynamic that not many societies developed, and it is so ingrained to the process of European colonialism that it sets this kind of conquest or settlement apart from examples like the Roman conquest of Judea, for instance. The Gauls, to give an example, were not conceived as indigenous people by the Romans. They were simply another people, another gentium. They were to be approached through law, the jus gentium, and brought into the glory of the empire. As Mahmoud Mamdani argues, therefore, it is not conquest that invents indigeneity, but rather the creation of a modern settler state. The creation of colonialism itself creates the settler-native binary. There is, therefore, in my opinion at least, no pre-modern or pre-colonial encounter indigeneity. If modern colonialism did not exist, indigenous people wouldn't either. It is therefore not possible for a settler colonial project like Zionism to produce indigenous people. Again, as Mamdani argues, the settler can never become native. Now, of course, there is one key case where Jews in Palestine did potentially qualify as indigenous people, the old Yishuv, the original Jewish community in Palestine before the invention of Zionism. Arguably, this community existed in a modern relation of domination within the Ottoman Empire. It occupied a non-dominant sector of society and had historical and geographical continuity in Palestine. Ironically, though, it was the invention of Zionism and the subsequent colonial project of the second and third Aliyah that robbed the old Yishuv of the chance to be ultimately recognized as an indigenous people. As socialist thinker Moshe Machover argues, Zionism could not base its colonial ambitions for Palestine in the ancestral lands occupied by this indigenous Yishuv. These lands were simply relatively modest in size. Zionism therefore needed to ground the claim to a much larger area, Eretz Israel, to which a global Jewish nation could lay claim to. This was once a very contentious proposition, that Judaism was an ethnically bounded nationality as opposed to a religion. Early anti-Zionists rather found this to be an anti-Semitic proposition that matched European anti-Semite claims that Jews were a foreign element or a different race than the nations where they lived. As French anti-Zionist Alfred Naquet argued in a polemic with Zionist Bernard Lazare in 1903, quote, "If it please Bernard Lazare to consider himself a citizen of a separate nation, that is his affair. But I declare that although I was born a Jew, I do not recognize Jewish nationality. I belong to no other nation but the French. Are the Jews a nation? Although they were one in the remote past, my reply is a categorical negative." End quote. Nevertheless, the construction of this global nation was indispensable for the success of Zionist plans, and in the midst of the brutal anti-Semitism of the first half of the 20th century, culminating with the Nazi Holocaust of 6 million Jews, it did not take much to convince the world's Jews that they needed a nation-state of their own. Jewish nationalism seemed to them at the time like a logical defense mechanism. But it was the construction of this global nation that blurred the lines between the old Yishuv as a non-dominant community in Mandatory Palestine and the earlier settler community of Zionist Eastern European Jews. Once the Jewish nation of Israel was consolidated, there was no room for a Jewish indigenous population within a Jewish state. By the time George Manuel wrote The Fourth World, the old Yishuv had no reason to join in the struggle. As Mamdani succinctly puts it, the old Yishuv was native, the first Aliyah were immigrants. The second and third were settlers. Because of this, in fact, it was the establishment of a colonial project in Palestine that led to the emergence of a different native settler binary, that which exists between Israel and the Palestinians it subjugates. In other words, when Israel was born as an exclusively Jewish state for Jews and Jews alone, it was arguably born alongside a corresponding indigenous people, Palestinians. Indeed, just like Moroccan colonization has converted the Sahrawi people into an indigenous people, Israeli colonization has arguably turned Palestinians into an indigenous people as well. This is an inescapable consequence of Israel's colonial character. This is not, I should note, a consequence exclusively reserved to Israel. Take, for example, the case of Ethiopia, a country that escaped 19th century European colonization. While many African communities that survived colonization all around the continent eventually became capital I indigenous people, the simple fact of being a people lowercase indigenous to Africa does not make Ethiopians indigenous. On the contrary, it makes non-dominant populations within Ethiopia that survived the country's modernization policies in the late 19th and 20th centuries capital I indigenous with regards to Ethiopia. The Majang people, the Anuak people, for instance, are capital I indigenous people in Ethiopia, in the sense that they exist in a colonial relation with the Ethiopian nation-state. In fact, one could argue even some rural Ethiopian Jewish communities may have qualified as indigenous vis-à-vis Ethiopia, like the Beta Israel community. But as with the old Yishuv, Israel's promotion of mass emigration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in the 1980s and 1990s arguably dislodged any possibility of claiming this vis-à-vis Israel or Palestinians. If tomorrow the Aymara people of Bolivia create an exclusively Aymara state that subjects Quechua people to secondary colonial relations, then these Aymara may be able to claim an indigenous identity vis-à-vis Bolivia, but not an indigenous status vis-à-vis the indigenous people of their new state. Indigeneity is, to a degree, as I mentioned above, a relational identity that exists on a binary with coloniality. This whole disquisition makes sense if we look at indigeneity from the perspective of the rights international law confers to it. How would Jewish indigeneity work vis-à-vis Israel? Does this mean that under Article 10 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the State of Israel does not have the power of eminent domain because indigenous people, as presumably all Jewish Israelis would be, cannot be relocated to another land without their prior free and informed consent? Does this mean that the State of Israel must engage in prior consultation with the entire Jewish population and secure their free, prior, and informed consent before enacting legislation, effectively requiring Israel to become a direct democracy on account of Article 19? Or does this mean that under Article 16, the national project to revitalize Hebrew as the official language of the State of Israel constitutes a violation of the indigenous rights of certain Israeli Jews who did not speak Hebrew and were forced to assimilate to it like Yiddish speakers or Ethiopian Jews? Or maybe this means that the IDF needs to disband, given that under Article 30, the state cannot deploy military activities in indigenous land. The International Law of Indigeneity is designed to communicate with indigenous peoples' colonial identity, and so breaks down when it is applied to the workings of a colonial entity like a modern nation state. Any nation state, I should add, not just Israel. We simply do not have the theoretical framework to accommodate the idea of an indigenous people no longer relegated to a non-dominant status that deploys its own state-centric coloniality. When indigenous people speak of decolonization or indigenous sovereignty or liberation, they normally don't mean it as an inversion of the colonial paradigm where it would now be them who get to oppress some other non-dominant group. They usually mean it as the disassembling of the nation-state's colonial structures and the creation of new decolonized realities where colonial oppression is definitively eliminated. As George Manuel said all those years ago, as he reclaimed indigeneity for the colonized, the objective of an emerging fourth world would not be to follow in the steps of the third and imitate the trappings of the colonial Western nation-state, but that, quote, the nation-state would learn to contain within itself many different cultures and life ways, some highly tribal and traditional, some highly urban and individual. So, to recap, Jewish Israelis, to the degree that they are the direct and dominant beneficiaries of a colonial project which subjects an otherized population to non-dominant and secondary status, cannot be indigenous themselves, at least not from the perspective of international law and not in relation to Palestinians. As for the Jewish diaspora, given that they by definition do not display continuous presence in the territory, they are a diaspora and have not really experienced modern colonialism, they would also not fit comfortably within the concept. Only certain Jewish communities like the Old Yishuv and Beta Israel communities could claim formal status under international law as capital I indigenous peoples, but in these cases the deployment of Zionist policies of assimilation into a settler colonial project, namely Israel, has dislodged these potential claims in practice. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you, and see you next time.